The white people of New Orleans were scared. So were the black people. A federal judge had ordered the city to open its public schools to black children, and the parents decided that if they had to let black children in, they'd keep their white children out. They let it be known that if any black children came to school, they would be in trouble. So the black children stayed home too, except for Ruby Bridges, that is. Her parents sent her to school all by herself. She's just 6 years old. And the first, and for the better part of that 1961 school year, the only black child to attend class in a white New Orleans school. Every morning, Ruby walked through a heckling crowd of protesters to an empty school. White people lined up on both sides of the way and shook their fists at her, yelling, sneering, and holding signs. They threatened to do terrible things to her if she kept coming to their school. But every morning at 10 minutes to 8, Ruby walked head up, eyes straight ahead, straight through that angry mob. 2 U.S. Marshals walked ahead of her and 2 walked behind her. She then spent the day alone with her teachers inside that big, silent school building. Like others, Harvard University professor Robert Coles was curious about Ruby's courage, and he went down to find out what made her tick. Why was she, a little 6-year-old girl, able to stand up to such constant pressure day in and day out? Coles talked to Ruby's mother, and in his book, The Moral Life of Children, he tells us what Ruby's mother had to say about the situation. There's a lot of people who talk about doing good, and a lot of people who argue about what's good and what's not good, she said. But some just put their lives on the line for what is right. While a lot of people were debating the issues of racially integrated schools or merely talking about doing what was right, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges put her life on the line and did it. She had a bit of grit. Something in her heart transferred to her feet. Esther has that kind of grit. She too came to a moment in life where she had to put her life on the line for what was right, and something in her heart transferred through to her feet. Esther 4:16. I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Here's the Esther most of us know. Esther at her best, a woman of courage and grit, a hero of faith. But before this point in her story, she has done some things we might legitimately wonder about or question. She has apparent compromises in her life that make us nervous. Human imperfections that challenge our traditional view of this biblical hero. Until now, Esther has kept her faith private. Like Mordecai and the other lukewarm Jews of the exile, she had been caught up in the good life of Persia. But now a special strength fills her. She puts her life on the line for what is right. If I perish, she announces. From that moment on, no one can ever again doubt her allegiance to her people or to her God. But why the turnaround? What made the difference? Why was Esther so willing now to unfurl her Jewish colors after 5 years of careful secrecy? After 9 grueling days of Middle East peace talks at the Wye River Plantation in Maryland, Israel and the Palestinians were back on the road to peace. Israel's security concerns dominated the October 1998 negotiations that drew together such heads of state as Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, the late Jordan King Hussein, and the United States President Bill Clinton for a face-to-face dialogue. Finally, in exchange for more West Bank land, Israel won a detailed Palestinian pledge to conduct war on terrorism. One of the sticking points was the Palestinian Constitution that called for the total destruction of Israel. After all, how can two people talk of peace if the very national charter of one party in the dialogue demands the complete annihilation of the other? Round and round they went on that one point until the Palestinian officials agreed to cut the inflammatory language. Even as the deal makers were earnestly at work, a Palestinian terrorist lobbed 2 grenades into a crowded bus station in Beersheba, wounding scores of innocent civilians. On the heels of signing the Woe Accord, another Palestinian terrorist with a carload of explosives attempted to ram a bus carrying 40 Israelite children to school. An Israeli soldier died in the blast that he courageously diverted from the bus. I can only imagine what it's like to be a people marked for death, to have it in official state-sponsored writing, no less. The Israeli Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem has a large bronze statue of a faceless Jewish woman holding a lifeless child in her arms. As you look across the well-manicured lawn and see her, you realize she portrays the unimaginable anguish, pain, and sorrow the Jewish people have experienced through the generations. It forcefully depicts the reality that there exists a calculating enemy that is ruthless and destroys thoroughly. How often have Jeremiah's agonizing words rung true for the Jewish people? Jeremiah 31:15. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children, and she refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Not only did the sinister edict Haman concocted call for the complete destruction of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire, it marked a date on the calendar as well, Adar 13. It was to be one fell swoop. Esther 3:12-13. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. In case you wonder what impact this decree had on the Gentile community, look at the last verse in chapter 3, verse 15. The couriers went out, impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued in Susa, the capital. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. So Haman and the king execute a document that calls for the ethnic cleansing of an unwanted people, and then they sit down for a few beers. It shows how disconnected we can sometimes get from the reality that of our behavior and the disturbing impact that our actions have on other people's lives. While Haman and Ahasuerus sat down over their drinks in the palace, the general public wandered around the streets in bewilderment and confusion, not unlike those in or near the Jewish ghettos and other European scenes of horror of the late 30s and 40s. They're basically asking, what is going on here? Why have those in authority ordered this? What terror struck their own hearts? What fear filled their own minds? They're asking, when are they going to do the same thing to me? What moral outrage blazed in them? We see it graphically illustrated in the irony exhibited by Oskar Schindler in his heroic attempts to save 1,000 Jewish workers during the Holocaust. He's a philandering Gentile, prone to the proverbial wine and women, but he nevertheless stood aghast at the ethnic cleansing taking place before his very eyes, and he did something about it. He couldn't just watch it happen. According to the book of Esther, the common man and woman in the street couldn't make any sense of it either. You know, when a bomb explodes, the blast often affects people even at a distance. The percussion may deafen them or knock them over. Most of the time, bomb victims are initially not aware of what hit them. In Esther chapter 4, the shock waves of the king's edict that burst forth on the Persian Empire finally reverberated within the walls of the palace, and now they bowl over Esther herself. The scene begins with Mordecai showing up at the palace gate dressed like a Halloween scarecrow. Esther 4, verse 1. When Esther learned all that had been done, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. So imagine this for a moment. Instead of being dressed in his proper court attire, Mordecai is wearing a loose-fitting, dark-colored, coarse garment made of goat's hair and is hanging on him like a gunny sack. On top of that, he has thrown ashes from the fire all over himself. He appears ghastly and unclean as he wails loudly and incessantly. Bitterly, he moans and he groans. He's flailing his arms. He's staggering as if he's demon-possessed. Mordecai held nothing back. It was a vivid expression of grief. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs brought her the news, she too found herself caught up in a seizure of agony. Even before she knew what was happening, she convulsed in a genuine fit of personal anguish. Verse 4. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her. The queen was deeply distressed. This behavior was not normal for Mordecai. Through their back and forth exchange through one of the king's servants, Esther finally learned the shocking truth about Haman's plan. Mordecai gave her all the inside information about all that had happened, even down to the specifics regarding the exact amount of money in the deal and the date marked off on the calendar. He also sent along official evidence. A copy of the text of the edict. Have your queen read this, he said to the messenger. It was signed with the king's signet ring. My question is, where did Mordecai get that inside information? He obviously has someone friendly to him on the inside of the palace because he knows the secret details of the information of the formation of that death warrant, and he had a copy of the warrant itself. Those secret details include the precise accounting to the financial arrangements for the destruction of the Jews agreed upon by Haman and the king. Haman agreed to pay 10,000 talents of silver to the king. That is 375 tons of silver. Mordecai has carefully covered all his bases. He wanted to make sure Esther understood this was no rumor, but deadly real. Not only was Mordecai careful with the information he communicated, he appealed to Esther to do something about it. Esther 4, verse 8. He also gave a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication for him and plead before him for her people. But Esther resisted. Verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king into the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king these 30 days. So Esther's first reaction is a negative one, based on the fact that palace protocol forbade her to follow Mordecai's instructions. If she violated it, she could die. The gist of her three-part argument ran something like this. Number one, you cannot just walk in on the king. To enter the king's court without prior invitation means death for anyone. Everybody knows this. Number two, the only exception to instant death is the king's special mercy and favor shown by extending his golden scepter, but who wants to take that chance? And number three, the king hasn't even invited me to see him for 30 days. In other words, my influence with the king is greatly diminished. Although I am still queen, I may have no influence with Ahasuerus' heart unless it changes toward me and his favor is renewed. It wasn't as if Esther would be talking to Ahasuerus that night before they went to bed. They wouldn't be sitting together at supper or reading in bed before the lights went out so she could just kind of say, oh, by the way, honey, no. That's not how it worked. Now, Mordecai realizes Esther is scared out of her mind. Who wouldn't be? He also knew her real fear was revealing her identity, letting everyone know she was a Jew. So he argued with her. Mordecai countered with three significant statements that, if acted upon, could alter the course of the history of the Jews or even her personal destiny. See, he read into Esther's reaction an inclination to self-preservation, that she wanted first and foremost to save her own life. So he warned her against thinking that she would remain safe and secure within the palace. Esther 4:13. Do not imagine that you can escape any more than all the Jews. In other words, you have no better chance of survival than any other Jew in the entire empire. Then he stated, verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. In other words, Mordecai is saying, don't have any doubt about this, Esther. God will deliver his people, but if you remain silent, both you and your father's house will die. You and your family will become extinct, while God's work will go on no matter what. And it's interesting to note that at this point, Esther has exhibited realistic feelings of fear. She can see no solution except to compromise, to keep quiet, to put even more distance between her and her people. Interestingly, the narrator passes no judgment on Esther's initial reluctance to stand up for her people. The story is so true to life. Esther was human. When the pressure comes down on us in a way that threatens our security, we're scared too. So was Esther. Being brave is easy when we're protected and secure, when we don't have to risk anything. But now, Esther has everything to risk. She was afraid to reveal who she really was, afraid to identify with her people. You can't escape it, Mordecai asserted, and if you keep quiet, you're going to die anyway. The same thing happens to us. How often have God's people found themselves in similar situations? It's the case with many of us even today, and it will be again during the time of trouble in the end. Whenever God's people are afraid of becoming involved or of taking a stand or of showing their true colors, they place themselves at an even greater risk. They cannot escape becoming involved. If they remain in a compromising situation, they will die. And again, I want to state the narrator does not condemn Esther's initial reluctance to stand for her people. He simply reports the story. The same is also true of the apparent moral compromises in Esther's life. The author does not criticize her questionable lifestyle choices. He simply creates a provocative image of that sad reality. Even even then, he doesn't say clearly or in any great detail exactly what those compromises were. He leaves it to our imaginations to fill in the blanks. In doing so, he draws us into the story in such a way that we confront not only the moral and spiritual principles at play, but we confront the reality of our own fear, of our own compromises. The book of Esther is not concerned with the picky details of what Esther compromised at, or what we might be compromising at for that matter. The point of the story is to create not guilt, but moral and spiritual conviction. See, Bible stories engage us as we observe the story, and we then they deeply impress our own moral life. The story of God's redemptive work can inform our own moral intelligence. So do the stories of the people in the Bible. Finally, Mordecai asks, who knows whether you have attained royalty or come to the palace for such a time as this? That word time, the Hebrew word is et. It involves time conceived as an opportunity or a season. It's a space of time or an appointed time, implying some kind of response or answer to the spiritual realities of that moment. When Mordecai says, who knows if you have come to the throne for such a time as this, that is probably the deepest theological statement in the entire book of Esther, because it hints at a larger picture that incorporates the seemingly isolated events of our life. For Esther, the time had come for her to find out whether or not her selection as queen was simply a social accident. Now, perhaps, she could witness in her own experience the mystery of a hidden God who works within history for the preservation of his people in spite of where they might be in terms of faithfulness to him. Mordecai's words do go down in history as one of those unforgettable turning point speeches. It's one of those warnings that makes a critical difference in a person's life because someone puts things into pinpoint perspective. You know, when the victorious Nazi army stood poised on the shores of Normandy, ready to invade England during the darkest hours of World War II, only the stout heart of England's Prime Minister Winston Churchill barred the way. Many people think his speech to Parliament on June the 4th, 1940, was the turning point of that war. This is what he said. We shall go to the end. We shall fight on seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. It was a defining moment. Words do make a difference. And this is the kind of message Mordecai sent to Esther. This is your hour. Stand, speak, die, but whatever you do, don't be silent. This is the time to speak up. Unfurl your colors and stand for your people. Now, I want you to notice Mordecai's newfound bravery. Remember, he too had carefully hidden, or at least didn't openly express his own identity. Like many of the lukewarm Jews of the exile, he had faded into the woodwork. He had gotten caught up living the good life of Persia. But there was a defining moment, as we have seen, when Mordecai literally stared evil in the face of the person of Haman. When he confronted with all that Haman symbolized, he grasped the spiritual issues in a new way. It was a moment he knew deep down inside he had to act. Now was his chance, now or never. He felt compelled to step out and reveal his identity. Mordecai had to be outwardly who he was inside. It's at this moment, then, we see how his decision to own his identity and refuse to bow to Haman actually made him brave. So now he can press Esther to make the same decision. How about it, Esther? What's it going to be, girl? Will you stand up and be counted? It's time to own your identity. I have. Now he is no longer telling Esther to keep quiet, something he's been doing for years. Obviously, this is not the same Mordecai from earlier in the story. It just shows us how whenever we make a decision to follow God, to do what's right because it's the right thing to do, God inspires us. We'll see this same principle come to reality in Esther's life as well. Once she shakes off her spiritual lethargy and she accepts her identity as a daughter of the living God, she finds herself filled with power and confidence. This newfound boldness comes with the moral decision, and it is more than psychological. It results from us saying yes to the Holy Spirit's work in our lives. God's grace can take us spiritually flabby, morally thin, lukewarm, disconnected from God and His people, and caught up in our world, and actually strengthen us. And with each step of the way, makes us stronger and bolder and more committed than ever before. That is the wonderful story of Esther. One of the burning questions that Robert Coles had in mind when he visited Ruby Bridges was, what secret spring do people like Ruby Bridges drink from when the moment comes for them to act in the face of danger and trouble? Where do we get the inclination to turn our backs on safety and comfort and do the very thing we're afraid to do? Where do we get that kind of energy and passion and courage? Coles says he had no luck with explaining Ruby Bridges' indomitable courage in normal psychiatric terms. But a comment made by a white school teacher, however, caught his attention. She related what she saw one morning when Ruby walked to school. A woman spat at Ruby, but she missed. Ruby just smiled at her. A man shook his fist at Ruby. Ruby just smiled at him. Then she walked up the steps of the school. She stopped. She turned around and she smiled one more time. You know what she told one of the marshals? She told him she prays for those people, the ones in the mob, every night before she goes to sleep. Well, that reference to prayer led Coles to examine Ruby's church-going practices. He began to realize how much of our courage is linked to our sense of self-identity, of who we are in the spiritual world. Like the Jewish children Els Ungvari worked to save during World War II. Els was just 23 in 1940. She was in Rotterdam training as a social worker. She was attached to an orphanage where, among others, there were a number of Jewish children. That year, the Nazis stormed Holland, and Els joined the Dutch underground. Because of her early experience with Jewish children, she was assigned to Amsterdam. There, the Nazis herded up terrified Jewish families to wait for freight trains to take them to concentration camps in the East. Her job was to persuade these terrified Jewish parents to turn over their children to her. Can you imagine? She would then take them 3 at a time by train to the neighborhood of Nijmegen, where their underground would hide them in a monastery. Some of the parents refused, took their children with them to die. Others had a hunch of what was in store for them, and they entrusted their little ones to Els and went on to die without them. Can you imagine? On the train, those Jewish children could have at any time exposed Els. Once the Levi dropped his pants and displayed his circumcision, a sure giveaway in a country where no male Gentile was circumcised. Little Alex blurted out to the man in the next seat, "I'm Jewish. Are you Jewish too?" Hannah was making a fuss and was told to settle down. "Why?" she pouted. "It isn't Shabbat today." Els made it to war's end, working in the underground until the liberation of Holland. But What intrigues me is the sense of identity that little Abby and Alex and Hannah had. They saw themselves in clear contrast to the larger world. It was hard for them to keep from revealing to others who they really were. In his book, Courage to Be, Paul Tillett suggests that an understanding of courage assumes an understanding of your identity. Courage and identity are linked. While courage has many faces, you can show courage by advancing or by retreating, by dying or living for a good cause, by throwing off your yoke or by bearing it. At the bottom, it has to do with a sense of identity. Who am I? What do I really value deep down inside? Where do I place myself in the moral space? Whom do I identify with? See, Esther's dilemma is one of identity. Who is she really? Who are her people? Who is her God? Mordecai had asked her to go into the king to implore his favor and plead with him for her people. Esther's biggest obstacle was not going in before the king, it was in revealing her identity. Until she fully owned that identity, Esther would never have had what it takes to reveal herself and put her life on the line for what was right. For 5 years, she had been caught up in the middle. The lure of the Persian culture and life had thrown off her sense of self, creating another almost virtual self, a self detached from the living God. Mordecai's earlier advice to keep quiet had not helped. But now Esther only has a brief slice of time to weigh Mordecai's counsel. When we have become used to keeping our faith private, when we've been so absorbed in our world and its sphere of influence, it is difficult to shift gears, adjust our focus, and take a visible stand for God. But Mordecai's strong encouragement became for Esther words of empowerment that challenged her to fulfill her destiny. In the midst of this defining moment, any sense of disconnect Esther may have felt between herself and her people, her faith and her God, once and for all dissolved. Esther, the young woman of grace and dignity and beauty, became a person of great courage, strength, authority, and purpose. Why? She owned her identity. As such, her compliance with Mordecai's challenge is considered a great moral victory. In that defining moment, Esther changed from fear to faith, from compromising to courage, from evading faith to declaring it. Ironically, Esther found her personal hour of decision to be a moment of finding herself. More important, she opened the way to experience God in a new and exciting way. Walter Anderson asserts that courage is a 3-letter word, and that word is yes. Esther finally said yes to God. From that moment of self-discovery, Esther changed, never to be the same again. As Eugene Peterson writes, whenever there is a people of God, there are enemies of God. A realization of the fact that there is an enemy forces a reassessment of our priorities. The function of Haman is to force a decision on the one thing needful. The moment that Haman surfaced, Esther began to move from being a beauty queen to becoming a Jewish saint, from being an empty-headed sex symbol to becoming a passionate intercessor, from the busy, indolent life in the harem to the high-risk venture of speaking for and identifying with God's people. Just like Mordecai, resisting evil had to do with revealing her identity. It meant letting those around her know who she really was, where she stood, and what she believed. In other words, where God was in her life and how she related to his will. For Mordecai, resisting evil had to do with taking a personal stand because of a religious principle. He understood and acted on spiritual issues before any crisis hit. For Esther, however, resisting evil came at a moment of an unthinkable crisis, a scary moment of decision she had to quickly make under the dreadful threat of an impending death. Both Mordecai and Esther awakened from their enchantment with Persian life. When the stakes became clear, Esther picked up faith and marched forward, grasping opportunity. Something deep within her heart transferred to her feet. Esther's response to Mordecai is both an acceptance of her destiny and a confession of faith that God can and will use her. It will be the same with God's people in the last days. Just like Esther and Mordecai, the most important issue in that day will be one of identity. The people of God will make their irrevocable choice based on who they really are deep down inside their private innermost world. The question then will be, do God's people in their heart of hearts identify with the kingdom of the living God and the unnegotiable truths of his word, or do they see themselves as a part of the bewitching realities of a fallen world? Of course, it is God who graciously engineers these kinds of defining moments in the lives of his people. Will we put our lives on the line for what is right? We never will until we know who we are. God is committed to helping us define our spiritual identity. The same God who pressures us into such defining moments will also give us the ability to handle them. Now, I want to make something clear. The view of self-identity is not some human sense of being, but it is a self-surrender to God. Spiritual identity and courage it brings at the bottom have to do with surrender to God. Spiritual identity is relational. It's something between you and God. Mordecai's words to Esther, "Who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" shows a deference to God's ultimate sovereign control. And Esther's response, "I will go, and if I perish, I perish," indicates a self-surrender to that same sovereign God. Once again, the story of Esther brings us behind the scene. Behind the scene is a confused and terrified heart. Behind the scene is a moment, a defining moment of personal destiny. Behind the scene is a God who graciously pushes his people to the very brink, knowing that in that defining moment of personal destiny, they find their true identity, and then they are given the courage to live for him with a renewed passion. Sooner or later, God offers each one of us a moment of courage. We will all stand at this crossroads sometime. And when we get there, we have to decide whether or not we will do the right thing, even if it means putting our lives on the line. No one can decide for us. They can teach us, they can inspire us, they can threaten us, but no one can act in our place. Each one of us must finally do it alone, in keeping with our point of reference, with our identity. When these moments come, we can cling to the words of Hananiah the prophet to King Asa. 2 Chronicles 16:9. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose hearts are loyal to him.